Good morning, Read 180 students. Today is Wednesday, April 22nd, and we are going to continue analyzing the short story, The Lottery. We have been working on the middle part, or the second part of the short story. So today's lesson 7, our learning target is going to be, I can describe how characters respond or change as the plot or sequence of events moves towards an ending. And then I can identify important events in a text and cite evidence. So what we're going to do next is, if you look at this slide, we're going to go back to page 133, and you should have part 1 already completed. This was from the other day where you needed to fill in the setting, characters, and plot for part 1. Now you'll notice that I have given you some answers so if you don't have the correct ones on your sheet, you don't have to erase what you have, just add to your answers. If you don't have this information, I want you to take some time. You can pause the recording and add the information. So when we look at part 1, again, that one was already done for us. We know that the setting is taking place in the summer. It's 10 o'clock a.m. in the morning, and it's on June 27th. And the place, again, is the village square. It's kind of a gathering spot of the town. It's a place where people can congregate or come together freely for an event. Now, you are to look at this next section on characters. And the question you were to answer was, what are the villagers like at the beginning of the story? Now, remember how we said it's the beginning. They're all kind of coming from their houses, from their chores, from their fields, from their houses. Kids are gathering. And we notice that the villagers seem very friendly. They're talking to each other, kind of almost in groups, like the men got together with the men, and the women got together with the women, and the children were getting together, playing and running around and having fun. They were probably sharing stories about what's happening with their families. Sometimes we call that gossiping, but they were probably very glad to see each other. So at the beginning of the story, the villagers are very kind and very friendly towards each other. They're interacting with their neighbors and their friends. If we look at the plot, what happens at the beginning of the story, we know that the villagers are gathering for this annual event. And we know it takes place every year at the same time. We know that the children were assembling first, and we notice that in this part, the boys were gathering stones. All right, so again, if you don't have some of this information, if you're missing it, I want you to go back in and add to it. And again, you can pause your recording at this point. All right, so now what we're going to do, since we finished reading yesterday, we read pages 138 to 143. And today we're actually just going to review a little bit again, so the middle part of the story. So what I want you to do, again, thinking of setting, which is your time and your place, your characters, which are the villagers, and then the plot, which is your sequence of events. What happened in the middle of the story? So what I want you to do now is pause this recording, and I want you to scan through pages 138 and 143. And I want you to fill in the time and the place. Again, if it really hasn't changed, you can probably just copy it from part 1. But your next part would be, what are the villagers like once the lottery begins? So once this is actually started, what have you noticed about the villagers? And again, remember, you want to have a complete sentence. 1 and 2 words are not going to be enough to answer this. So finding text evidence, go back into those pages, and if you don't remember, you might have to reread or skim and scan that. But what did you notice about how the villagers were acting once the lottery began? How were they handling themselves? How were they standing? So look for that kind of information and complete that second part. And then what happens in the middle of this story? Again, if you were telling this, think about the characters. I want you to think about it in order, what happens, okay? All right. Again, you can pause this recording. Once you have finished these 3 pieces of page 133, you can take a picture of it and submit it to Google Classroom. Okay, at this point, we are going to take a little closer look at pages 140 and 141. Now, we're going to reread, and this might help just a little bit. So we're going to reread pages 140 and 141, and hopefully this helps you, especially with page 141 when we're analyzing characters. As we reread this, I want you to think about the key idea and what happens in this section of the story. Okay? Before we do that, though, let's take a look at the academic vocabulary words on page 140. Now, again, you'll notice that you'll have the meaning. We have 2 words. The first word is raise, and the second word is apart. And off to the left-hand side, you'll see I have the definition or the meaning of both words. So you just have to copy it onto page 140 in your booklet. And then I have an example. So the word raise means to lift something to a higher level. Okay, so my example could be some schools raise the flag at the beginning of each school day. Now you're going to finish this example by answering, why do some teachers ask students to raise their hands before they speak? So I want you to, again, go ahead and fill in this sentence. Again, make it very complete and thorough. Your second word is apart. And the definition or meaning of apart is divided by something. And my example would be, if you and a friend talk too much in class, you may have to sit apart from each other. Now you're going to finish the example, and this one is, what's one way to measure how far apart one thing is from another? So one way to measure how far apart one thing is from another is to what? Go ahead and complete that. So now that we know the meanings of those 2 words, we're going to reread pages 140 and 141. And again, think about the key idea. What's happening in this section of the story? Okay? And at the top of page 140. Well now, Mr. Summers said soberly, guess we better get started. Get this over with so we can get back to work. Anybody ain't here? Dunbar, several people said. Dunbar. Mr. Summers consulted his list. Clyde Dunbar, he said. That's right. He's broke his leg, hasn't he? Who's drawing for him? Me, I guess, a woman said, and Mr. Summers turned to look at her. Wife draws for her husband. Mr. Summers said, don't you have a grown boy to do it for you, Janie? Although Mr. Summers and everyone else in the village knew the answer perfectly well, it was the business of the official of the lottery to ask such questions formally. Mr. Summers waited with an expression of polite interest while Mrs. Dunbar answered. Horace is not but 16 yet, Mrs. Dunbar said regretfully. Guess I gotta fill in for the old man this year. Right, Mr. Summers said. He made a note on the list he was holding. Then he asked, Watson boy drawing this year? A tall boy in the crowd raised his hand. Here, he said, I'm drawing for my mother and me. He blinked his eyes nervously and ducked his head as several voices in the crowd said things like, Good fellow, Jack, and glad to see your mother's got a man to do it. Well, Mr. Summers said, guess that's everyone. Old man Warner make it? Here, a voice said, and Mr. Summers nodded. Okay, paragraph 19 on page 141. A sudden hush fell on the crowd as Mr. Summers cleared his throat and looked at the list. All ready, he called. Now I'll read the names, heads of family first, and the men come up and take a paper out of the box. Keep the paper folded in your hand without looking at it until everyone has had a turn. Everything clear? The people had done it so many times that they only half listened to the directions. Most of them were quiet, wetting their lips, not looking around. Then Mr. Summers raised one hand high and said, "Adams." A man disengaged himself from the crowd and came forward. "Hi, Steve," Mr. Summers said, and Mr. Adams said, "Hi, Joe." They grinned at one another humorously and nervously. Then Mr. Adams reached into the black box and took out a folded paper. He held it firmly by one corner as he turned and went hastily back to his place in the crowd, where he stood a little apart from his family, not looking down at his hand. "Allen," Mr. Summers said. "Anderson, Bentham." Okay, and we're going to stop with the reading right there. But I want you to now look at where it says Analyze Character on the right-hand side. How does Mr. Summers feel about his role in the lottery? Use words from the text to support your answer. Okay, and also, how does Mr. Summers interact with the townspeople? What kind of opinion can you draw from that based on what we read? So again, you're going to be looking at analyzing the character, and you want to go back into probably paragraphs 19 and 20. If you have to reread, you can stop the recording, go back to paragraphs 19 and 20 to look for that information. Okay. Also, we're going to look at that strategy toolkit, analyzing character. Noting how people in the village, both individually and together, react to the day's events can help readers get a better sense of the possible significance of those events. Okay? So again, we might want to stop and think about how does Mr. Summers' role in this lottery and his feelings about the lottery, how does that kind of help us with the other characters, the villagers in the story? So I want you to think about that. We'll talk about more about that tomorrow. The last thing you're going to do is the section that says stretch. How do Jack Watson and Mr. Adams react during the lottery? What does their behavior suggest about how they feel about this tradition? So I want you to go back probably again into paragraphs 19 and 20. You're going to go back to paragraphs 16 and 20 to analyze that. Okay? So you're going to want to go back to paragraph 16 and paragraph 20, and that should help you find the evidence that you need. So again, how do Jack Watson and Mr. Adams react during the lottery? So look for those names and reread that section. And what does their behavior suggest about how they feel about the tradition? So again, are there any key words that we read that the author put in there that can help us kind of figure out how those characters are feeling without coming right out and telling us that? All right, so that's it for your lesson for today. Again, make sure that you take pictures of the pages that you completed. Make sure you submit it in Google Classroom because then it shows that it is marked off. Again, make sure your answers are thorough, complete. 1 and 2 words are not going to give you the points you need. And remember, I'm using that rubric with 5 being you're doing an awesome job, 3 is you're doing okay, and then number 1 would be you need to put more effort in. And again, you can look back in previous slideshows for that rubric, or I will also post it in the important resources section in Google Classroom. All right, I hope things are going well for you. It looks like there's a few of you who are keeping up on a daily basis. That's the way I really like to see you doing this. If you are falling behind, please, please, please know that you got to get this made up and recorded so you can get credit for your work. All right, I will see you for today. I miss you guys. I wish we were here in class. Keep your fingers crossed that we'll be back soon.